witnesses are in person. Members have the option to appear either in person or virtually. Every day, Americans get up, go to work, and do their jobs. But as we know this week, our Republican colleagues refused to do theirs. On Tuesday, this committee met to vote on 5 outstanding nominees for the Federal Reserve. Republicans didn't show up, not a one. Instead, they went AWOL in the fight against inflation. At this pivotal moment in our economic recovery, everyone understands we need a full Federal Reserve Board. It would be the first time in nearly a decade where all 7 members confirmed members sat at the Fed to help tackle inflation. Republicans have no solutions, only political stunts. Americans don't want more political theatrics. They want actions and solutions to bring down costs. We will not stop fighting for these nominees. These nominees, let me just tell you what they've all done. They've met with every senator, every single senator who asked for a meeting, on committee, off the committee. They met with committee staff, majority and minority. They offered to meet with many of my colleagues who refused to meet with them, and some of them then boycotted the vote. They answer every question posed to them at the hearing. They answered every question submitted for the record, more than 200 of them in a timely manner. One nominee even answered questions submitted after the deadline. If we're going to continue growing our economy, we need all 7 governors in place. We need these professionals working and debating and making decisions about monetary policy and interest rates and jobs and tackling inflation. I implore my Republican colleagues to show up and vote. Vote yes, vote no, just show up and vote. It's your job. I implore, and the American people expect, for you to do your jobs just like they do every day. Let me read a few headlines from the past few weeks. Strong jobs report shows resilient economy. January jobs report crushes expectations. Biden sets first-year record with 6.6 million jobs added. In my state, long derided as the Rust Belt, Ohioans have been waking up to headlines like these. Intel picks Ohio for largest chip factory in the world. Hyperion Fuel Cell Company to open largest Columbus factory in a decade. GE Aviation lands $6.8 billion engine deal in sign of rebound from pandemic. Intel's investment, game changer for Ohio jobs. America is in the midst of unprecedented economic growth. Our GDP grew by 5.7% last year, the strongest annual growth in 40 years. For the first time in 2 decades, and this is, I think, particularly significant, our economy grew faster than the economy of China. Job creation hit an all-time high. We added 6.4 million jobs last year, an average of more than 500,000 jobs every single month. We saw the fastest drop ever in the unemployment rate. American entrepreneurs started more than 5 million new businesses in 2021, another record. Raw job numbers, of course, don't tell the whole story. They don't tell you how good the job is, what kind of wage it pays. On that front, though, the news is perhaps even better. Wages are rising, particularly for hourly workers who've been left behind in past economic recoveries. Workers are finally starting to share in more of the economic growth that they create. American families' disposable incomes were higher in 2021 than they were before the pandemic, even adjusting for inflation. Assistant Secretary of Treasury Ben Harris said 2 weeks ago, household balance sheets were exceptionally healthy, due in part to the American Rescue Plan, other government pandemic assistance, and brisk wage growth. This progress was possible because of the American Rescue Plan. We promised shots in arms, money in pockets, workers back on the job, and the American Rescue Plan delivered. We know the challenges made. For the progress we've made, we can't deny that many of the people we serve say they don't feel it. People are exhausted. They're tired of this pandemic. They're tired of the anxiety. They're tired of the way it's divided neighbors and divided schools and divided families. The number one thing we do to improve our economy, improve people's lives, is to defeat this pandemic. And we are on the right course. Cases and hospitalizations are dropping. Because of the American Rescue Plan, great majority of Americans are now vaccinated. Everyone can get a booster shot. We no longer have to live in fear. We also know the pandemic has caused inflation to run too high. Workers feel it every time they go to the grocery store. Inflation's a real problem, and one that we as a country need to address directly. It's all the more reason why we need a full Federal Reserve Board. Pandemics revealed our supply chains are too long and too fragile. Causes higher prices in some industries. No one wants to have to go to 3 different stores to get their shopping done or to have every option they try to buy on back order for months. It's maddening, it's draining, it's frustrating for the American public. We know how to fix it. You make more things in America. For too long, our trade policy, our tax policy have encouraged corporations to move production overseas. It's cost us millions of jobs, especially in the states of Pennsylvania and Ohio. It's contributing to our supply chain problems today. It's time to bring these supply chains back home. The House and Senate have passed bills to spur domestic manufacturing and research and development. They will allow us to better compete with countries like China. They'd support the production of key inputs like semiconductors. We should put a comprehensive bill on the president's desk soon. We also took an important step to speed up our supply chain by passing the bipartisan infrastructure bill to improve our roads and our bridges and ports, making it easier and more efficient for American manufacturers to get products to market. As important as these steps are, government is not the only actor here. Corporate consolidation is reducing competition, giving consumers fewer choices and workers fewer options. Nobody explains better in the meatpacking industry than my colleague from Montana, Senator Tester, what's happened there. Too often corporations increase prices while cutting an even larger check for executives and shareholders. The Wall Street Journal tells us that two-thirds of the largest publicly traded companies reported larger profits in 2021 than they did in 2019. In recent weeks, CEOs have bragged to Wall Street about their ability to increase prices on consumers. Let's be clear, raising prices is a choice, is a decision that corporations make. They can make a different choice. They could reduce the amount of stock buybacks. Millionaire executives could actually take a bit of a pay cut or even just get a smaller raise this year. But there's nothing forcing them to make a better choice because there isn't enough competition in the economy. We need an economy that works for everyone, not just those at the top. We can't declare the recovery complete until all workers can find a job that pays them fair wages, that treats them with dignity, and that allows them to keep up with the cost of living. Today, we'll hear from all three members of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, Chair Rouse, Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Boushey. These are skilled economists who understand that behind all the charts and models and tables are real people with hopes, dreams, and ambition. As Chair Rouse said in January, the actions that the Biden administration have taken led, quote, to unprecedented improvement in our economy and important investments made in its future productive capacity. I look forward to hearing more about this year of unprecedented growth, the current state of the economy, and plans to continue this expansion. Ranking Member Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to start by observing it's a little bit rich to be lectured by the chairman about not attending a markup of nominees when the chairman personally led the Democratic boycott of the Senate Finance Committee markup of 2 Trump nominees. There were several other Democrats on the committee who participated in that boycott. I guess what's good for the goose is not good for the gander. It's also rich to hear wailing and gnashing of teeth about vacancies on the Fed board and this newfound Democratic concern over inflation. First of all, I and my Republican colleagues have been on record for well over a year warning about inflation risks, warning about the excessive spending. Democrats criticized us for wanting to normalize interest rates and Fed policy. And yet here our Democratic colleagues are pushing for yet another inflation-fueling spending blowout bill. Fact is, the Fed is fully functional. The FOMC has 9 of its 12 members in place. They could raise rates today if they wanted to. They could do it tomorrow. They could do it at any time. But what's really ironic is that it's the chairman's decision not to move 5 nominees forward. We made it clear, I made it clear last week to the chairman, repeatedly, publicly, and privately, we are perfectly happy to vote on 5 of the 6 nominees. That would be 4 Fed governors and the director of the FHFA. If we did, actually most of them would get considerable Republican support. They'd move on. And if there were a concern about vacancies on the Fed, then the chairman could fix that very quickly. He chooses not to. He prefers to have the vacancies. That's his choice. It's also interesting how some of my Democratic colleagues have been so passionate about ending the revolving door. In fact, you could argue some have practically made a career out of railing against the revolving door, where people go from a powerful government regulator to go work for the industry that they regulated, they enrich themselves, and then maybe they come back to do it for another loop. Is there a more archetypical example than Ms. Raskin? Senator Warren recently tweeted, called Randy Quarles corrupt because after he left the Fed, he went back to the firm, the private equity firm that he had founded himself. So I guess it's corrupt if a Republican does that, but the rules don't seem to apply in the other directions. The chairman said that the candidates answered the questions. Let me be very clear. Ms. Raskin was far less than candid with us. She failed to disclose that she even was a director of Reserve Trust. She failed to disclose the $1.5 million she made for that service. She failed to disclose hundreds of pages of writing, hours of speeches. When she was asked, how did she get on the board of Reserve Trust in the first place, she said she couldn't recall, which is odd because the founder and chairman says in an article in today's Wall Street Journal, he's known the Raskins for decades. When Ms. Raskin was asked if she ever contacted the Fed on behalf of Reserve Trust, first she evaded the question repeatedly, and then eventually she replied by saying she couldn't recall. Well, that's funny, because the Kansas City Federal Reserve president recalled the conversation very well. The chairman of the Federal Reserve Trust, recalled the conversation. He wasn't even part of it. But we're supposed to believe that Ms. Raskin just couldn't recall. And let me remind everybody why this is important. Reserve Trust is a fintech company. It's based in Colorado and applied for something that's extremely valuable, a master account at the Fed. To my knowledge, there's not a single fintech in America that had gotten that. And unsurprisingly, they were denied. Their application was turned down. Then Ms. Raskin, on the board, called the Fed. And shortly thereafter, the Fed does a 180-degree reversal and approves the master account. And to the best of my knowledge, as of today, there's a grand total of one fintech in America that has a master account with the Fed, and it is Reserve Trust. So we asked an obvious question. Why the reversal? Why the 180-degree change? What changed? First, we got stonewalled. Then we finally get a partial answer from the Reserve Bank of Kansas. And let me just quote one sentence that summarizes it. Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas says, after this denial, and that's a reference to the denial of the master account application of the Reserve Trust. After this denial, RTC changed its business model, and the Colorado Division of Banking reinterpreted the state's law in a manner that meant RTC met the definition of a depository institution. That's from the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. The only problem with that is on Tuesday night, the Colorado Division of Banking says that's not true. And this is what they said, and I quote, "We consider the statement that the division reinterpreted state law as a misrepresentation of our practice." So it remains entirely unclear what happened here. All we know is that Ms. Raskin was in the middle of it. The firm on whose board she sat applied for a very, very valuable account with the Fed. They were turned down. She intervenes. They get approved, and we can't get an explanation of what happened here. Is that fair to all the other fintechs across America that would also like to have a master account, and they've been turned down? How is that fair to anybody? And how is this committee doing its job if we don't insist on getting some answers to this question? But we get stonewalled. We get answers from the nominee that she can't recall, and we get basically nothing from the Fed. So, Mr. Chairman, it's your choice if you want to continue to preclude the possibility of having 4 nominees from the Fed confirmed and the FHA director. We are quite happy to process those nominees. But we want answers before we vote on Ms. Raskin. And let me just close with a quote justifying a boycott of recent markup of nominees. And I quote, "By refusing to demand honest, transparent information about the business dealings of these nominees, the committee failed to do its job on behalf of the American people." That is Sherrod Brown, February 1st, 2017.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I don't want this to be back and forth because we have witnesses here for a real reason, but let me just say two quick things. One is our not showing up in the Finance Committee and the Help Committee to discuss and actually ultimately vote on two, as it turned out, particularly one corrupt cabinet nominee, Dr. Price, who was in office only about 4 or 5 months and resigned under a scandal, did not stop the committee from voting. It was a protest that they had not answered nearly enough of our questions. They didn't give the kind of response that Sarah Bloom Raskin, Governor Raskin, and others gave, the fulsome kinds of answers they gave to dozens and dozens of questions. So we were protesting that, but didn't block a vote because the majority could still go ahead. That's the difference in this, and the Banking Committee has never done that. Second issue on voting on four noms, and I know that's Senator Toomey's contention over and over. He knows, we all know, that that would set a precedent. If the ranking member can decide based on answers to questions that a nominee gave. I don't like the answers on climate change, especially, as one that has offended many, many Republican members. Then if a ranking member can say, I don't like the answers to the questions, then simply withhold a quorum. It means the ranking members then choose whom we're going to vote on. So any ranking member, whether it's finance or banking or veterans or any other committee, can simply say, I didn't like his answers, I didn't like her answers, we're not going to show up to vote. Then essentially the ranking member determines whom we're going to vote on. So we're voting on all five of these Fed noms. We're voting on FHFA. They're all very qualified. That's our intention when we get back in March. To our witnesses, Dr. Rouse, Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Boushey, we welcome you to the committee. I believe this will be our first hearing in a long time, as long as I can remember, with the full CEA before the committee. Chair Rouse, please begin your testimony. Thank you for joining us.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me and my colleagues Heather Boushey and Jared Bernstein here to testify today. Just over a year ago, President Biden entered office with a full agenda, a pledge not only to fight the pandemic and support economic recovery, but also to rebuild our economy for sustainable and more widely shared growth. Success was not preordained. The country faced a still raging pandemic, a weak economic recovery, and historic job loss. Thanks to the collective efforts of the administration, Congress, and the Federal Reserve, we have been able to recover with strength and speed. And importantly, we have begun to lay the groundwork for an economy that is stronger, more resilient, and more equitable. Over the last year, millions of Americans have gained protection from the worst of COVID-19. Businesses have been able to resume activity, and children are back at their school desks. Economic recovery has been strong. In 2021, GDP grew faster than it has in almost 40 years, and the U.S. job market gained 6.7 million jobs. Unemployment is down to 4%, years earlier than projected. Child poverty is likely to be reduced by almost 40% in 2021. The American Rescue Plan was a critical component of this recovery. It served as an insurance policy to address the uncertainty of a global pandemic and support the economy as the virus and the tools to tamp it down evolved. The emergency measures worked, resulting in a robust economic turnaround. Families and businesses have had the means and resources to cope with in the short term. Ultimately, workers and small businesses have avoided the lasting damage we typically see when economic crises are allowed to linger. But as President Biden has made abundantly clear, helping Americans weather the pandemic is simply part one of his economic vision. The administration's strategy encompasses what the President and Treasury Secretary Yellen have called modern supply-side economics. That is, we must make investments in our economy to boost labor supply, raise productivity, reduce inequality, and create strong, sustainable growth. The bipartisan infrastructure law is a historic step towards realizing that vision, providing long overdue investment in our nation's roads, bridges, water systems, and broadband infrastructure. We commend the bipartisan work of many on this committee for making these necessary investments, and know your governors, mayors, and constituents are grateful. Unlike the American Rescue Plan, which was short-run relief designed to be spent out over the course of the pandemic emergency, the infrastructure law will span out across the country over years, building and strengthening the foundation our economy needs to increase productive capacity. Other administrative actions this year will also contribute to long-term economic growth. Examples include the whole-of-government approach to increasing competition in markets, addressing climate change, and fostering greater equity. Of course, challenges remain. The gains in our economy have taken place against the backdrop of a once-in-a-century pandemic economy, where what we know about downturns and recoveries has been tested. Vigilance is required to ensure we do not backslide when curveballs like Omicron come our way. And Americans are feeling the pinch of inflation at the pump, in grocery stores, and in the marketplace. The pandemic itself has been a major driver. Consumers have shifted their spending from services to goods, and global supply chains have been severely tested. A lack of workers has stymied the supply of goods and services as well. In the near term, the principal tools to curb inflation rest with the Federal Reserve, which is why it is critical to confirm the 5 highly qualified nominees now. The administration also has some tools it can deploy, as demonstrated in recent actions to improve supply chain disruptions at the ports and increase capacity of the trucking industry. In the longer term, we must make real investments, be that in our roads and bridges or people and ideas. Sustainable growth will only come about if we are able to increase economic capacity and allow more Americans to participate productively in our economy. The economic challenges of 2022 must, of course, be met, but we must also lay a foundation for future generations. In doing so, we must create an economy that rewards work, not wealth. The administration's economic agenda aims to ensure that those in the middle class who have been largely left out of the economic investments for the past 40 years will finally benefit, ensuring that growth is more broadly shared. We need Congress to act on the president's full economic agenda to achieve these goals, providing necessary funding to continue to address the pandemic and keep the economy functioning, passing USICA to bolster competition and build resiliency into the market, enabling the energy transition to curb climate change, and making Build Back Better a reality so that families can afford the needs of everyday life like prescription drugs and childcare. As noted by 17 Nobel Prize-winning economists, these long-term investments not only build a stronger economy, but also ease long-term inflationary pressures. President Biden's economic vision is predicated on the fact that the economic status quo has not worked for all Americans. For decades, it has largely benefited those at the very top. We share his vision for a stronger and more equitable economic future for our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have 2 questions for you, and I hope to get, if answers are short enough, to Dr. Boushey and then Dr. Bernstein. Chair Rouse, many American workers and families are concerned about high prices at the grocery store and the gas station. What's your assessment of inflation right now? What's the best way to fight it?
Okay, I guess I'm still on. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So we understand that inflation is affecting consumers' pocketbooks with higher prices at the pump, grocery stores, for various goods. Our view is we expect inflation to moderate over the coming year because we believe that the factors that have been causing high inflation will begin to ease as COVID cases gradually decrease. You know, inflation is fundamentally a mismatch between supply and demand, which has partially reflected a change in demand as consumers have shifted their spending to goods. So what we need to do is we have to, to accommodate demand, we know that we have to have increased supply. Producers have been increasing their prices because of the constrained supply. So we need to ensure that the ports are strong and that we have robust investment in our infrastructure. I will say in the short term, this really is in the purview of the Federal Reserve, which is why confirming the nominees is so very important. The administration is doing what it can to increase supply chains, to get more workers back to work, including truckers with apprenticeship programs and other efforts. In the medium term, the competition agenda is so very important because we know concentration in concentrated markets that gives some price pressure for firms. It reduces innovation. It can cause lower wages for workers. Importantly, the president's economic vision of investing in infrastructure, in people, and ideas is really the long-term solution, building economic capacity for addressing longer-term price pressures.
Thank you. My friend and colleague, Rob Portman, called the bipartisan infrastructure bill a deflationary bill, that it will help drive down prices for American consumers. Do you agree with that?
What I agree is that the bipartisan infrastructure law it makes critical investments in our roads, ports, bridges, broadband, takes lead out of pipes. Those are important investments which increase our economic capacity. By increasing capacity, we can accommodate more demand, and so therefore it helps to ease inflationary pressures.
Thank you. Dr. Boushey, your work as an economist is focused on how we fix problems with inequality in the economy, whether by race, class, or gender, or even where you live. The stock market always seems to bounce back first from a downturn, while the lowest paid workers who experience the biggest job losses are also the slowest to reap the benefits of the economic growth that they essentially created. How do we ensure that economic recovery reaches all workers, from steel workers in rural Ohio to newly unionizing baristas at Starbucks, and not just those at the top?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. That's a great question, a good place to start. You know, the President has been very clear on this issue. In fact, in his address to Congress last year, he said that his economic agenda focuses on building an economy from the bottom up and middle out, and really making sure that we see strong, stable, and shared economic growth. And that is why it was so important when he first came into office to focus on getting our economy, addressing the pandemic and getting us back to full employment. That's why the American Rescue Plan was so important. There's charts behind us that show some of the successes, getting 6.7 million workers into jobs. And importantly, many of the gains, particularly in wages, have been felt by workers at the bottom end of the wage spectrum. So when you get folks back to work, it has this pulling up effect. Now, of course, that hasn't solved all of the issues around inequities, and I want to point out a couple other things that we focused on early on. One thing that the administration focused on was making sure that the PPP program, the Payroll Protection Program, actually went to those who needed it the most. And there's now research showing that actually once the administration came into office, more business owners of color and women were able to access that program. So that's one way. And what that shows is that you actually need to have a focused attention, which is why President Biden has, as Chair Rouse said, these whole-of-government approaches to equity, to addressing climate change, and to issues around market structure and competition. Because it is only through making sure that all of our policies are focused on both being inclusive and making sure that those at the top are not able to be unduly rewarded, will we be able to have that kind of strong, stable, shared growth. I want to just end with a couple of notes to echo what Chair Rouse said. I mean, certainly the bipartisan infrastructure law is an important down payment on equity in a variety of ways, but I cannot stress enough how important Build Back Better is, that more fulsome agenda to make sure that we are addressing the needs around care and climate across the U.S. economy.
Thank you, Dr. Boushey. Dr. Bernstein, quickly, and sorry, there's not a lot of time left. The pandemic revealed longstanding weaknesses in our supply chain, as you know. What should Congress and the administration do to make supply chains more resilient and bring prices down for consumers?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As was mentioned, the administration is already engaged in working with the ports, in working with the trucking sector, doing all we can to help ameliorate some of these pressures that are showing up in our elevated inflationary reads. The ports of LA and Long Beach process 40% of the nation's containerized imports. They actually broke their 2018 record last year for annualized imports by 13%. The number of containers sitting on the docks that for 9 days has come down by 60%, and so on. In the interest of time, perhaps we'll be able to get back to this. But underscoring what both of my colleagues said, by investing in the nation's infrastructure, whether it's roads, bridges, electric vehicles, climate, we help to strengthen supply chains by onshoring some critical capacity that is now very much, for now, which are very much dependent on offshore arrangements. We also help to bolster not just supply chains, but build in the kind of resiliency that's clearly been missing. Certainly, microchips are a great example of that, and USICA is a very important policy solution in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2019, wages were rising, and they were rising faster than prices. And wages were rising faster for low-income workers than they were for upper-income workers. So we had workers, unemployment reached record lows also, and workers were able to improve their standard of living because their income was rising faster than their expenses. Now, we're in a situation where wages are rising, but prices are rising faster. And the reality is, for most workers, they're falling behind because the cost of the things they need to buy every week is going up faster than any increase in their income. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics in February 10th summarized it pretty neatly. They say, and I quote, real average hourly earnings decreased 1.7%, seasonally adjusted, from January 21 to January 22. The change in real average hourly earnings, combined with a decrease of 1.4% in the average work week, resulted in a 3.1% decrease in real average weekly earnings over this period. I know that's not the intention, but isn't it true, let's start with Dr. Rouse, that most low and middle income workers have experienced a bigger rise in the cost of the things they need to buy than in their incomes?
Well, I appreciate the concern very much, Senator, and we're all very concerned about inflation and appreciate that is, the purview of the Fed in the short term, and it's important that we have a full slate of governors. I just would like to point out the chart on the far right.
Okay, good. I'm sorry, but look, we all know that the number of governors is adequate to do whatever they need to do about inflation. So let's not go there.
Okay, so let's look at this chart on the far.
But can you confirm the simple
So
fact that for most workers, wages are not rising as fast as prices?
So some recent estimates by economists Emmanuel Saez and Zuckman suggest that actually, if we look at the bottom 50% of workers, that their market income before taxes and benefits is greater now than it was in Q4 2019. And you can look, if you look after taxes and benefits, that they're actually ahead. So
is your position? So we saw the number of 7.5% as the most recent annual rate of inflation. We also know that low and middle income people have a worse experience than that because they pay a disproportionate amount of their income for things that are rising more rapidly than 7.5, like gasoline, like groceries. Are you telling me that you think that the average worker in America is more than keeping up with inflation?
So what we know is that look, inflation is not, we do not want to see this level of inflation going forward. And that's why the president is focused on doing what he can. We would like, the Federal Reserve is likely to adjust how its posture has been towards inflation. But we do know that household balance sheets, because of the efforts of the federal government, the Federal Reserve, have been maintained through this pandemic, which is what is reflected in this chart on the left.
Okay, I'm surprised that we can't candidly acknowledge the obvious. Wages are not growing as fast as prices for the large majority of workers, and these workers are falling behind. Yes, if you have a lot of accumulated assets, they've appreciated in value, and you're probably doing fine. But the Americans I'm concerned about in this case are those who don't have a huge accumulated asset. Let me ask a question of Dr. Boushey. Contrary to what I occasionally hear, it is an objective fact that the 2017 tax reform made the American income tax code more progressive. We lowered the burden for everybody, and in the process, changing rules shifted the percentage, the largest percentage, to more upper income people. My understanding is the administration supports legislation that would raise the SALT deduction from the $10,000 limit that we put for rich people to deduct their high state and local taxes to $80,000. I don't know any working class people who have $80,000 worth of state and local taxes. And yet, it looks like the administration supports that. My understanding is from joint tax that the top 10% of income earners would get about 88% of the benefit of lifting the SALT cap. So why does the administration want to have this huge giveaway to wealthy people who choose to live in expensive jurisdictions?
So the administration has not come out with a position on the SALT tax at this point, and I'm not here to negotiate that with you today.
I'm sorry,
what
maybe
I can tell you.
Did you not endorse the Build Back Better legislation? Doesn't that, the House passed bill?
So the
includes
president's
that.
framework has been very clear on his priorities in terms of tax reform.
Okay, I'm just saying.
and He has
so,
a very robust agenda.
Do I just want to be clear? You do not support the House passed bill?
I just said that there's not I'm not here to negotiate that particular piece of the legislation here today, but the
Doesn't sound
president
like
has
much of an
put out
endorsement, okay?
a very fulsome agenda around tax reform, focusing on taxing wealth and not work, and focused on taxing folks making more than $400,000 a year.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Menendez is on. Is Menendez remote? Senator Tester is recognized.
Beautiful thing. I like that. Thank you very, very much. Just a couple things, and I don't want to get into an extended debate on this. I do want to get to the economy, and I want to thank you all for being here. But when Reserve Trust got their master account, they were not classified as a fintech. It was 3 years later they did that. And then there's an outfit by the name of Jack Henry that did the same thing. But what's more important here is to know that when a secretary, a very important secretary, came to my office during the Trump administration, and I asked him about disclosure and conflicts of interest, he looked at me and said, "That's none of your guys' business." A very important secretary. And he didn't answer any of the questions because he didn't think I needed to know any of the questions when I had him in my office. I could have tried to organize so we didn't have a vote on him, but the truth is I just voted no, and that was that. That's the first question. The second thing is that, Senator Toomey, I know you have great skills, and so does folks across the aisle, to be able to come in here and try to persuade minds. And I know it's difficult, because it's difficult from our side to change your guys' minds too. But part of showing up is having that debate. And part of showing up is having that debate before we have the vote. And God only knows what could have happened and didn't happen because nobody showed up. The last thing I would say is that I think you're giving Sarah Bloom Raskin way, way, way too much credit. I serve with a lot of folks here, and I'm sure when I get out of this position, they will continue to say, "Hey, John, would you consider this or consider that?" In whatever position I'm in, whether it's being a farmer in Montana or a meat cutter or whatever. And I would do the same thing that I think anybody on this committee would do, and that is, I'll take a look at it, I'll give you a fair shake, but I ain't just going to do what you tell me to do. And you guys are making the assumption that Sarah Bloom Raskin made a request and they just rolled. I'm going to tell you, if that's the case, we got the wrong people on these regional feds. We ought to take a look at replacing all of those, because if that's the process that's used for giving a master account, then we got bigger problems than Sarah Bloom Raskin. That's all. And I don't want to talk about any of that anymore. We just need to try to make this Senate functional, and not showing up does not add to the functionality of the United States Senate, which I think we can all agree is pretty damn dysfunctional at this moment in time. I want to talk about child care because it's something I hear about almost all the time when I go back to Montana, and I'm going to talk about housing, which is what I almost always talk about when I go back to Montana. And the question I'm going to ask you is pretty simple, really, when it comes to child care, and I don't care who answers it. I think we got a huge problem, and I think folks have figured it out. Because of the pandemic, when they were staying at home, they looked at their bottom line and said, "Hey, I got more money not paying child care and not working than busting my hump working and paying for child care." So the question becomes, if we're going to have affordable child care and accessible child care, because that's important, I think, absolutely important in rural America, but probably important in urban America too. If we're going to have affordable child care, how do we do that? How do we do that? Or do we just assume the private sector will take care of the problem? And if we do, how long will that take? Because my grandkids are actually in high school now, and when they were in child care, it was over $10,000 a head for them to be in child care 10 years ago. So does anybody want to respond to how we make child care more affordable, more accessible, and what role the government should play in that?
I'm happy to take that question, Senator. This is such an important issue, and that is why addressing childcare was both an important part of the American Rescue Plan and also an important part of Build Back Better. So, I mean, here's the thing. It's, childcare businesses are, they're out there every day trying to provide a service to American families. It's a service that's incredibly expensive to provide, especially to get the kind of quality childcare workers that families need. And families can't afford those costs. And so the crux of what the president proposed in Build Back Better was to make it affordable for families to be able to pay for childcare by capping the amount of income that families have to pay, so that while at the same time subsidizing those businesses so that they could provide high-quality care with qualified care providers to families all across the United States. And, we're already seeing just how challenged that industry is right now. The number of workers in childcare has fallen over the course of the pandemic, as childcare centers have really struggled to make ends meet. We've seen now that the money from the American Rescue Plan is going out to those providers, out to over 150,000 providers nationwide, to help them cover their costs during the pandemic. But all of this, it's about kids' well-being, and we know that quality childcare is important for our future economy, but it's also about making sure that parents can get to work. We have questions about making sure that labor supply gets back to where it was pre-pandemic, and a lot of that is about addressing this childcare crisis in America.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I'd love to get to housing, and I'd love to get to some job training issues, but I'll turn it back to the chairman and ranking member. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Frowns is recognized, from South Dakota, is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just begin by saying I appreciate the opportunity to participate this way, and I'd like to focus on inflation and the causes of it. And I'd like from our witnesses to talk a little bit about the differences between what may very well be demand side challenges versus supply side. My constituents in South Dakota, like Americans across the country, are being squeezed by higher prices across the board. Consumer prices in January were up 7.5% from a year ago. Energy prices overall were 27% higher in January than they were 1 year earlier. And electricity prices have jumped 10.7%. National gas prices have soared 40% since January of 2021, reaching the highest level since August of 2014. Right now, inflation, excuse me, and the CPI indications are of about 7.5% nationally, and PPI basically about 9.7%, which would suggest that there is going to be additional, or at least there is more inflation in our future rather than less. My question, Dr. Rouse, is what portion of this in your analysis, how much of this is due to demand side, where the Fed would basically have a role, versus the supply side, which, as you indicated in your testimony earlier, this is perhaps, both the president having some things to do and the Fed having some things to do. First of all, would you agree that the supply side basically would rest more on the presidential side and the demand side more on the Federal Reserve side?
Well, thank you for the question. So the way that I see it is that we have inflation because it was important for the federal government to support households, workers, businesses through the pandemic. That is to maintain demand. We see this in countries around the world that could afford to do so, that they maintained, that they protected their constituents through the pandemic. Supply wasn't able to accommodate that demand, and inflation fundamentally comes when you have a mismatch between supply and demand. So, there have been various estimates that have been put out that what we say the confidence interval is very wide, but we know that as we get through the pandemic, we will see regulation in both of them. And so, what I would say is that we're expecting that as we work through this pandemic, that the price pressures will ease. Outside forecasters are expecting inflation to be about half by this time next year.
Dr. Rouse, if I could, I really didn't mean it to. It's not intended as a gotcha question. I'm just curious. When we talk about inflation, we know that it's both sides, and look, we recognize that we did what we could during the pandemic to to be able to make sure that our economy could recover as quickly as possible. My question is just, right now with inflation where it's at, how do we go about addressing it? If we're serious about addressing it, how do we do that if we can't determine how much the Federal Reserve should do versus how much the administration should do? And that's my question is if you don't have that information, or if that's not part of the studies, why not?
So the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and this is, they're studying, and they will determine the speed and the size of their response. I will note that on the fiscal side, that the fiscal impulse has already turned rather negative. So we are already not putting as much, fiscal resources into the economy, which will actually be slowing down the economy relative to where it has been over the last 2 years. And we expect that as people come back into the workforce, as the pandemic is under control, that will ease some constraints. Getting people back to work will help on the supply side. And as the pandemic is addressed around the world in particular, that will help bring more goods as well. So we expect, so there is a role to play for the Federal Reserve and in terms of fiscal policy in helping us to normalize through this pandemic. I might,
Senator, let me just say a couple words, if I might, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. My only concern on this is that I really think it's difficult to bring this under control if we don't recognize how much of this is actually due to supply side issues versus demand side. And I think part of that is the cost of petroleum, which is going to impact everybody. And I think when we're not talking about what's happening right now in terms of, we talk about shutting down oil and gas leases on federal land and so forth, that sends a message of futures costs on crude and so forth. That may very well work well for Mr. Putin, because right now he's getting record profits out of the oil and gas that he's producing, while at the same time back here at home, what we're seeing is increasing prices for our consumers. I just think that needs to be taken into account, and it may not be a popular thing to talk about right now with the administration. I think the American people should understand that a lot of the inflationary trends that we're seeing are due to the inflationary pushes on the supply side, which is restricting the ability of us to have fuel prices right now down where they were a year or a year and a half ago. And I am kind of surprised that the split between the supply side and the demand side has not been a little bit more of the discussion that we should be having if we really want to get it under control. But Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
Dr. Bernstein, thank you,
if
Senator
you
Rouse.
don't
Dr.
mind-
Bernstein, please answer briefly.
I'll try to be brief, because I actually like the way you teed the question up, and I think that our view reflects much of the way you frame this, in the sense that both demand and supply are clearly playing a role. The Federal Reserve, of course, works more through the demand channel, and as you suggested, our work is and can help further on the supply channel. The answer to the question of how much should each should do everything it can until inflationary pressures normalize. What that means on the side of the government, and Congress definitely has a very important role to help here, is to focus on the near, medium, and longer-term supply chain constraints. And the near term, as I've mentioned, we've intervened extensively in the ports through trucking. Our competition agenda is, as Chair Rouse suggested, intended to help ease consumer prices in those sectors. And then over the medium term, we very much believe that investing in domestic semiconductor capacity is so important, particularly regarding cars, a real source of auto pressure. We talked a little bit about housing. That has the largest weight in the consumer price index. And over the longer term, the infrastructure bill and the measures in Build Back Better are designed both to increase the economy's supply side productive capacity and help reduce costs that consumers face. So I think your framework is actually the correct one. And I think between the work of the Federal Reserve and government trying to expand productive capacity and supply side, we can ease those pressures, perhaps as the forecast suggests, by the end of this year.
Thank you. Senator Menendez is recognized from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't come here to talk about salt, but since the ranking member raised it, let me just say, if I was Pennsylvania, I'd like the way things are. Pennsylvania gets $15 billion more from the federal treasury than it contributes to the federal treasury. So if we could do that, I'd be happy to make a deal with all my colleagues who have a problem with salt, that we'll just get back whatever we send. And New Jersey would be very happy. because there are maker states like New Jersey that invest in education and research and development, in infrastructure, that helps it drive the economy and sends billions to the federal treasury, more than it gets in return. So it's a maker state. And then there are those states that I call moocher states that get a lot more than it sends to the federal treasury. If you want to continue to have states that are maker states, that are blue chip states, that make money for the federal treasury, then just continue to ox the state and local property tax deduction, which is the longest serving part of the federal code in terms of a deduction, and you will see those states be less of maker states so that you can continue to mooch off of it. But let me move to the more current issue of the time. There's no doubt that American families are feeling the pain of inflation as supply shortages have wreaked havoc on the world economy. However, that pain has been magnified by companies that are hiding behind the headline inflation figures to justify raising prices and profits on the backs of hardworking Americans. And let's be clear, corporations are not the ones hurting right now. Here's a transcript of Kimberly Clark's last earnings call a few weeks ago. CEO Mike Hsu stated that the company took, quote, decisive action to offset the impact of higher costs with significant pricing actions. He wasn't kidding. The price of a 50-pack of Kimberly Clark N95 masks more than doubled from $23.19 to $57.15 from last October to January. And the company's plan for the future is not to deliver relief to consumers, but to resume stock buybacks, quote, as soon as we get the excess cash flow. It's amazing to seek profit beyond simply hiding behind the issue of inflation. Dr. Bernstein, are you seeing this occur in other sectors of the economy as well?
Yeah, profit rates and profit margins are highly elevated for firms across many sectors of the economy. That's a short answer to your question. I guess putting that in the context of our discussion, and by the way, I did want to correct something that Senator Toomey said. Actually, while you're correct about the year-over-year numbers, last month, real wages actually beat inflation. But I wanted to talk about this in the context of wage growth and inflation. It is commonly argued that wage growth is a source of inflation, and that is potentially true based on a full set of other factors that contribute to inflation, including productivity growth and the share of national income that's going to labor or to profits. And it is completely coherent within the algebra of how wages and inflation interact that non-inflationary wage growth can be paid for out of reduced profit margins. And I think that's relevant to.
Well, I just cited one quarterly profit call. There are many others in which clearly the companies are using the guise of inflation to ratchet up their earnings, and that is unconscionable. We have to think about ways in which that transparency can take place so that consumers know. It's just pretty astounding. Let me ask one other question. We're facing a dire, even as we talk about a growing economy, we have a labor shortage across the economy, which is contributing also, in my mind, to rising inflation and unmet consumer demand. There are currently nearly 11 million job openings nationwide across low-wage and high-school industries. Immigrants are ready and willing to fill those jobs. We had the Secretary of Energy in New Jersey the other day at one of our research and development centers. The four of the 6 people who made presentations were clearly immigrants to the United States, leading the way in innovation. Unfortunately, there's over 1.6 million immigrants still have pending work permit applications before USCIS, and over 8 million immigrants that are stuck in the broader visa backlog. Leading business groups, including the American Business Immigration Coalition, agree that robust immigration legalization provisions are urgently needed to address our significant labor shortage. What would each of you say is the role of immigrant workers in mitigating the current labor shortage and rising inflation?
Well, thank you, Senator Menendez from the great state of New Jersey. We completely agree, and the president, from day one of his administration, he sent a bill to Congress to modernize the immigration system. He has also issued an executive order directing a top-down review of barriers to access in our legal immigration system, as you know, on which U.S.-based employers rely to fill these critical labor needs. So in response to that order, agencies have worked to create efficiencies in the work permit process, expediting work permit approvals for health professionals, extended the period for which such permits are valid, and are actively considering other administrative actions to expand the labor supply. So immigration is part of the solution here. I will add that part of our labor supply challenge was going to happen just due to the natural demographics of our society. This pandemic hit at the height of pretty much at the height of the baby boom as they were retiring, and we have seen some excess retirements. I will add that a key part of getting people back to work will be addressing the pandemic and ensuring we have the tools so that people can get back to work safely and not risk their health. But there's no question that facilitating dealing with the backlog of these visas is top of mind. The president's team is working on it, and that is part of the solution as well.
Thanks, Senator Menendez. Senator Daines from Montana is recognized from his office.
Chairman Brown, thank you. And I just want to start off by echoing Ranking Member Toomey's comments earlier about the markup that occurred, that was supposed to occur earlier this week. It is truly a shame, in my opinion, that we didn't move forward and get 5 of the 6 nominees approved. I wrote a letter in August supporting Chairman Powell's renomination. And I know, given past concern from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the use of the revolving door, frankly, I'm a bit surprised that they would not share a desire to fully vet this nominee before moving forward. Turning to my statement, 2021 was a year of rampant inflation, growing from 1.4% at the start of President Biden's term now to over 7.5%. Inflation grew faster and is continuing to grow faster than wages for the vast majority of workers, meaning that paychecks are effectively shrinking every month as this continues. On an annualized basis, real average hourly earnings dropped 1.7%. And of course, other parts of the economy are feeling the pain. Homebuilder confidence. I grew up the son of a homebuilder. Their confidence fell for the second straight month, in large part due to spiking lumber and steel prices, as well as months-long waits for cabinets, garage doors, countertops, and just about everything else you would find in a standard home. Energy prices are rising. Gas up 40% year over year, fuel oil up 46% year over year, and up 9.5% in just the last month. And I just found it, frankly, startling. We're seeing significant increases of Russian diesel being imported now at a time when we're watching the Russians invade Ukraine. This, of course, not going unnoticed by Montanans and Americans across the country. Consumer sentiment is lower now than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. In fact, according to a recent Gallup poll, 71% of individuals living in households with incomes of $40,000 or less say that price hikes have caused their family financial hardship. 71%. Of course, we were all told all throughout 2021 by President Biden's administration that this inflation was transitory. I've not heard the word transitory lately, and it will come down. And many of us on this side of the aisle were questioning this belief this would be transitory. We didn't buy it. And sadly, our predictions now have come true. They're continuing to insist that a peak is just around the corner. Well, even if it is, I've not seen anything that suggests that 7.5% is far too high. We just don't need inflation to peak soon. We need it to plummet. Now to a few questions. Looking back at the economy in February of 2020, we saw what I would describe as a Goldilocks economy. We had wage growth across the board. Inflation was in check. Wages were actually growing the fastest for individuals at the bottom of the wage spectrum. To me, this broad-based, non-inflationary growth was about as good as it gets. My question for the panel is this: would you agree that the pre-pandemic economy from February of 20 is better than the economic picture as we see it here today? A simple yes or no will suffice.
I will agree that the pre-pandemic economy on net was looking fairly strong. However, that pre-pandemic economy reflected many years of rather anemic growth. It was reflecting, even in terms of wage growth at the median, we had seen a little bit, but there had been decades where at the median, there hadn't been robust wage growth. We know that there were gaps by race and ethnicity that had been longstanding. So I would argue that while in February of 2020, the bones of the economy were strong, that there were weaknesses there that this president felt we should address, which is why his economic agenda is designed to increase the economic capacity in order to generate more robust, sustainable growth that can be more equitably shared.
I'll weigh in on your question as well. The labor market is actually tighter now than it was then by some metrics. The unemployment rate was lower then than it is now, though not by much, 3.5 versus 4%. There are far more job openings now than there were then. The GDP, probably the most commonly cited indicator of economic health and growth, is considerably faster now than it was then, growing, which is consistent.
Dr. Bernstein, are you suggesting we're better off right now than we were in February of 20?
I'm saying that there are it's not a simple yes/no question, is what I'm more than suggesting. It's what I'm articulating here. There are a set of economic indicators: job openings, GDP growth, child poverty. Child poverty is actually lower when you factor in the interventions in the rescue plan in 2021, probably, than it was in 2020. We only have estimates of that so far. And that's very much a function of the president's rescue plan. By pulling the recovery forward, by getting shots in arms and checks in pockets.
Dr. Bernstein, I just firmly disagree with that. We had over $1 trillion of unspent COVID dollars at the end of 2020. And then on a purely partisan basis, our colleagues pushed another $2 trillion of federal spending into the economy in Q1 of 2021. And we warned this is going to have inflationary effects. So anyway, I just respectfully disagree.
Okay, well, I understand your point. But
the federal balance sheet now
Dr. Bernstein, hold on.
Okay, I'm out of time.
I want to answer the question that you...
Dr. Bernstein, wait a minute. Senator Daines, is that your last question? And then I'll
I think I'm out of time, Chairman Brown. I want to respect the committee.
Dr. Bernstein, a very short answer.
I talk about it here, but we just respectfully disagree.
Answer the question that you posed, Senator, and ticking off a set of indicators that are actually doing better now than they were then in the context of a 100-year pandemic, which I think is a remarkable achievement for our administration and those in Congress who helped us.
Well, let's keep in mind the federal balance sheet right now is trillions of dollars higher than it was before. Anyway, thank you.
Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this committee's non-transitory but relentless focus on this issue. And I would point out to my colleague, I spent a lot of time working with the former president's Treasury Secretary, Secretary Mnuchin, where we put about $5 trillion, $4.5 to $5 trillion under President Trump into COVID relief. We're talking about what's potentially driving inflation. I think those investments, I was proud to work with him on those investments, and I think they frankly saved this country from not only a recession, but potentially depression. I want to come to a topic that a couple members have mentioned, but I don't think have drilled down in, and that's our housing shortage. We've seen rents go up 13.5% nationwide over the last year. Some markets, it's gone up 20%. We've seen home prices double over the last decade. A lot of this is frankly due to housing shortages. We now have a housing shortage of about 1.7 million units, and that grows by about 150,000 units each year. And everything I've heard, at least, is that shortage is particularly acute not at the upper ends, not even on the rental side at the highest end rental, or it really is the most acute at low income housing. And that's one of the reasons why, working with the chairman and many of us on the committee, we had a robust housing package in the president's second part of his initiative that would have gone towards this supply issue. Because if you're looking at housing costs driving upwards of a third of CPI, and housing is a huge component of particularly low and moderate income folks' basic nut they've got to meet each month. If we really want to take on systemically, and not in a transitory basis, but in a relentless basis, the question of inflation, we got to increase housing supplies. So, Dr. Bernstein, and I'd then be happy to hear from other members of the panel as well. What should we be doing on housing supply? And I was going to ask two questions. I'll try to ask just one, recognizing I'd like to get from the whole panel. Housing supply, won't that address it? Inflation won't happen overnight, but we've got this is a long-term problem that's been developing over a decade. And beyond just direct government programs, there are tax initiatives like LIHEAP and others that, LIHTC and others that I think make some sense. Private sector, been bipartisan supported. LIHTC gives that kind of incentive for low housing construction to developers. Shouldn't we use these in our toolbox if we're really going to take on, not in a short term, but in a long-term basis, inflation?
Yes, that is an extremely important set of questions, and let me begin by thanking you for your leadership on this work, and as well as others on the committee. Let me start by just saying why this is so important, underscoring some of the points that you made, Senator. There is a long-term supply shortfall in the housing sector, and you mentioned 150,000 units each year deficient supply. Multiply that by 10, and you get to the number that you're suggesting in terms of a shortfall. This is a market failure that's particularly acute in the bottom half of the market. And why? It's because the math doesn't always add up for people to build, for builders to build, along with the problem of exclusionary zoning problems. This makes this key to the president's equity agenda, especially in rural areas and communities of color. And the third issue you correctly raised was inflation. Shelter is the largest single component in the CPI. Housing experts Jim Parrott and Mark Zandi recently wrote, quote, "If policymakers are serious about reining in inflation, then they have little choice but to take on the shortfall in housing supply." What can we do? The administration is already actively using its executive powers to increase housing supply and access. We've coordinated with various agencies, Fannie, Freddie, HUD, Treasury, to create, deliver, or preserve 100,000 affordable units over the next 3 years. But the administration toolbox, Senator, as you well know, is not nearly big enough to deal with the supply shortage that goes back a decade at least. Investments that we make now will pay off for many years to come. Ideas that we've put on the table, many of which you've helped champion, have a long history of bipartisan support, and they involve the tax credits that help to incentivize building on the supply side, where too often middle and low-income housing doesn't pencil out given land, permitting, materials, and costs, again, which predated the pandemic, resources to help build and renovate houses, and resources to build housing infrastructure through the Community Development Block Grant, which includes action on exclusionary zoning. I can say more about any of those details. It would probably take a whole nother hearing to go through them in the way they deserve, but let me stop there for now.
And I think we've run out of time, so I would welcome any of my Republican colleagues who want to work with me on bipartisan tax policy that actually incents the increase of supply. If we don't want to take a transitory approach and we want to take a long-term approach to deal with inflation, we've got to increase the supply of housing, particularly for low and moderate income people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Warner. Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for showing up this morning. It's been a fairly feisty hearing, it sounds like to me, over watching this back in the office and paying attention to the comments. And I will say, there must be millions of kitchen table economists, also known as parents, all over the country asking what in the world is the value of an economist degree in Washington, D.C. Because if we are failing to answer the simple question that Senator Daines asked, which is, are we better off today than we were a year ago? The answer is emphatically no. That's not a question that people at the kitchen table are asking in a serious manner. When you ask yourself if the average person in this country, whether inflation was better this month than wages, the cumulative effect of inflation in an average household in the country, when your gas prices are up 40% and your utilities are up 20%, the answer is no. If you have had a 4% increase in your wages and a 7% increase in inflation, the bottom line is that your spending power is down, not up. If in fact you can look at inflation as an additional tax on those folks with fixed incomes, are they better off? The answer is no. This is not a hard question to even dig into. This is a simple question that is clear. When your food is higher and your clothing is higher and your utilities are higher and your gas is higher, to suggest that we are anything other than worse off this year than we were last year, you don't even have to believe me. Ask the president's approval ratings, the lowest ever. Why? It's because the average American family is suffering through an incredible crisis that they don't have to hear what you are saying. They can see with their own eyes the disappearing dollars in their accounts. This is not hard to see. This is easy to see. What we should be asking ourselves is, how do we make it better? Not pretending as if it's not bad. It's really bad and getting worse. When you're at a 40-year high in inflation, this is not something that the average person says, I don't really understand what inflation is anymore. They don't even ask the question, what is the definition of transitory? Because this is not transitory. So the question I'd pose, if I had a question for all three of you, is, how do we tell the American people that the inflationary impact is not devastating to someone like the woman who raised me, a single mother, who's looking at her account go down and her challenges go up? How do we say to that person that there is somehow, some way, good news in the current economy? And frankly, the confusion that's going to be caused at tax time when we accelerated the tax refunds through the $300 a monthly payment, that leads to confusion and a delay in refunds because we thought there was a better way to deal with the child tax credit. I think that's going to add more confusion to this economy, less confidence in this economy going forward. So I hear what you're saying. And I think the average American is literally sitting there asking themselves, this cannot be the banking committee in the United States Senate unable to come to the conclusion that we came to in January 21, February of 21, March of 21, January of 22, February of 22, and we're going to be saying the same thing in March of 22 as well. So I'd love to hear how inflation is not having the negative impact that every other person in the country seems to be fully going through right now.
Well, Senator Scott, look, we understand, the president understands your kitchen table economics and your, what people are concerned around the table. Part of the challenge is we are in we hope, only 100-year pandemic. We've been living with this for 2 years. In this country, we've had 900,000 deaths. The cases, we are still living with this pandemic. What is hard for all of us to understand and appreciate is what would have happened without the American Rescue Plan, without the other efforts of the federal government and the Federal Reserve to rescue this economy and ensure that we got through whole. I appreciate that is a very hard counterfactual to contemplate. I am not saying that we are exactly where we want to be, but as we have highlighted, we have had the strongest recovery, on record. We are doing better than our peers. unemployment has fallen dramatically. I would remind the kitchen table, the kitchen table economists, that when the president took office, the economy was almost 9.5 million jobs short of where it was when the pandemic started. And we've recovered almost all of those jobs. So now we have people who want a job can get a job. That unemployment has fallen more quickly than it ever has in a recovery. And so while we have challenges, there is no doubt. And the president is focused on doing what he can in the short term to try to ease supply challenges, to nominate the Federal Reserve nominees, and Senator Toomey, I won't say anything more about that. But we know that we need to get inflation under control. There is no question about it. I think that the number one way that the president needs to be focused on, and we all need to be focused on, is getting this pandemic under control.
Thank you,
because
ma'am.
this is all driven by the pandemic.
Mostly because Chairman Brown's going to cut me off in a second, so I just want to finish up here because I think it's really important. I think you make some really good points. Proving a counterfactual is important. I, like many of my colleagues, would love to have been able to vote for 4 members of the Federal Reserve and get answers on the 5th one. I do think that unemployment has fallen without any question, partially because the long-term unemployed should be absorbed in those numbers as well. As we all know, especially you all better than I, that when the more people who are in the long-term unemployment line, the lower your unemployment rate goes. And I'll finally finish with this because you've been very gracious, Chairman, with my time, and I appreciate that more than I can say, that the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that had about 10% for COVID-related health, 1% for vaccines, and $1.6 or $7 trillion for spending that actually helped to fuel the inflationary impact that we are now trying to recover from, has also been problematic. Thank
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do hope we'll vote on the Federal Reserve nominees. Vote yes, vote no, but let's vote on all of them. We passed the American Rescue Plan just about a year ago. Because the pandemic had hit our economy hard, it had hit workers hard, millions of Americans were out of work. And as you've testified today, and as the facts show, and I think those facts are uncontested, we've seen jobs come roaring back, over 6.6 million jobs, a record in the United States. We've seen very robust real GDP growth of 5.7% in 2021. Now, one of the reasons we passed the American Rescue Plan was because families' incomes were being squeezed when they were out of work. That included the $1,400 individual payments. Did it not, Dr. Rouse?
Yes, it did.
And I keep hearing from our colleagues about how the real purchasing power of American families went down in 2021. It did not. Isn't it the case that real disposable income grew in 2021?
Well, so again, I will just refer to our chart here, which is some new evidence from economists at UC Berkeley, and which suggests, especially for the bottom 50%, that if you look at their market wages before tax and before benefits, that they're better off today than in the last quarter of 2019. And then when you add in benefits and after taxes, they are ahead. So we know that inflation is a challenge, but household balance sheets have
Well, so
weathered
look, if I'm a household, and what I look at is what is my purchasing power this year over last year. And isn't it a fact that real purchasing power went up in 2021?
It did. So these data suggest it did for most families, but we have to acknowledge that inflation has also been a challenge and has eaten into some of that purchasing power. But because due to the record GDP growth, there has been a very strong recovery so that household balance sheets are strong and many Americans are better off today than they were at the beginning of the year.
All right, and so, you know, as I look at that, when you factor in the individual payments from the American Rescue Plan, when you factor in the other relief, you know, taken together with people's wages, the data indicate that we've seen a growth in disposable after-tax income, and especially so for lower wage individuals. Let's get to where we are now, because there's been a lot of year-over-year comparison with respect to real wages. And I think, Dr. Bernstein, I think I heard you clarifying something that had been said earlier. But if you look at January's figures with respect to real wages, what do we see?
I will tell you what we see, but I'll also give you the beloved CEA caveat, which is that we never read too much into any one month. We're always looking for trends. However, we also look closely at the jobs report, and it did show in January that the hourly wage beat the pace of inflation. I think the hourly wage was up, if I'm remembering correctly, 0.7%. Inflation was up 0.6%. Now, that's 1 month. But it is indicative of trends that you've heard about from all of us here today. The strength of the job market, that was a month where we had an upside surprise in job gains of 467,000 jobs, well above what was expected, and a job market that was powering through Omicron that was very much upon the land that month. We should also underscore what Chair Rouse was just talking about, that when the job market tightens up as much as it has, bargaining power, leverage among working people goes up disproportionately for those in the bottom half. And that's one of the factors that's behind the stronger wage growth in the bottom half and what you see there vis-a-vis market incomes and disposable incomes.
So really quickly, if we're successful at beating this pandemic more and more, it does look like Omicron is on the downward trend, although you never know what will happen. But one of the issues we've seen, of course, is during the pandemic, people purchased a lot more goods relative to what they purchased in services. In other words, that balance changed. Can we expect that as people, get back out and can go to restaurants and movies, that pressure, that price pressure on goods will come down, and how would that impact inflation potentially?
That is certainly the dominant expectation, and it's one of the main reasons why forecasts for inflation predict that inflation will grow half as fast at the end of this year than it did last year. That goods-service rebalancing helps in that regard, because inflation in the goods sector, due to the dynamic that you're describing, has vastly surpassed that in the service sector. But we'll have to see. And look, forecasts have been wrong. And I think the thing that we're trying to stress here today, that both in terms of our administration's actions, in terms of strengthening supply chains in the near term, our work in the ports, our work with the trucks, and our legislative agenda, including the bipartisan infrastructure law and many of the productive capacity enhancing measures in the Building Back Better agenda, are extremely important to ease longer-term inflationary pressures.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Tillis from North Carolina is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unlike what Chairman Brown insists, I think I can have competing concerns at the same time. I think I can be concerned that the Biden administration's policies are propelling inflationary pressures higher, while I also believe that Ms. Raskin should provide answers to important questions. 36 separate "I do not recall" statements are simply unacceptable. To suggest that these concerns are somehow mutually exclusive, I believe, is ridiculous. Just this morning, Chairman Brown insisted his Finance Committee boycott in 2017 was because, and I quote, "they had not answered nearly enough of our questions." Well, let's review Ms. Raskin under this standard, just articulated by the chairman earlier in this committee. To date, Ms. Raskin has failed to provide numerous answers. Ms. Raskin began by failing to list her time at Reserve Trust, claiming to not even recall how she got the job. Ms. Raskin failed to answer repeated questions in her nomination hearing about her conduct lobbying her former colleagues at the Fed while at Reserve Trust. Subsequently, Ms. Raskin provided 36 identical "I do not recall" responses to questions for the record. And Ms. Raskin finally canceled and did not reschedule a meeting with committee staff so that we could clear these issues up and get real answers to important questions. So misrepresenting my objection to Ms. Raskin as simply not liking her shows a lack of understanding of my concerns. Now, Mr. Chairman, I also, or for the witnesses, I've been listening to the entire committee hearing in my office, And I was really struck by what Senator Scott was saying. He used the term kitchen table economist. Well, I'll use the term trailer park economist because I was one of those back in the 70s when I saw spiraling inflation, wrong-minded policies from the administration, gas prices that were to a point where I couldn't afford to fill up a 12-gallon gas tank. I was doing it about $5 at a time. That trailer park that I grew up in is still standing in Nashville. And I'll guarantee you, if I went there today and I presented the graphics that are behind the witnesses and said, you're better, right? We've had a historic recovery. We just saw the strongest recovery on record, which was just stated by one of the witnesses a few minutes ago. My guess is they're feeling the same way that I did when failed policies of the past put us in this position. For us to suggest that people are not struggling, for us to suggest that somehow that buying power of those folks that are living in the same trailer park that I did is somehow stronger, just absolutely conflicts with real world experiences that we see out there every single day. Mr. Chair, I also have to restate what Senator Toomey said earlier. For witnesses on at least more than 2 occasions to suggest that the way that we're going to fix the inflation problem is to get these board members confirmed, really either they don't understand that we have a functioning board that can take action today, or they don't want to acknowledge that fact because of an agenda to have these other board nominees confirmed before we get answers to questions. And incidentally, we were prepared to vote on 5 out of the 6 nominations in the markup. That the chairman decided to go all the way with the 6th nomination, Ms. Raskin, where we have serious concerns. For the witnesses, if the 55% of the CEOs believe that we have an inflation problem, why is it that you think we don't? Or why is it that you think that this should not be top of mind for President Biden's administration? Why is it, because you've mentioned Build Back Better several times, why is it that you think flooding the zone with even more liquidity today is somehow going to fix the fundamental problems we have with this economy?
Thank you, Senator. So the president is very focused on the concern of price increases. He understands that the price of milk and gas has gone up and that that's a real challenge for families. This is a president who cares about the middle class. That is his whole economic agenda.
If I may, because I want to try and be respectful of the chairman's time, but it just, because I've heard you and others say that Build Back Better is a solution to the problem, but I see several economists who say that it would cause inflationary pressures over the long term. It would take not months or weeks to recover from it, but we would get back maybe to reducing inflation over the course of years. How on earth can we think that that's the right way to go about fixing the real world problems that we have today?
So look, 17 Nobel Prize winning economists agree that Build Back Better is actually the antidote to inflation going forward, because it
going forward, but how soon?
It spends out.
Aren't some of those same economists saying that could be a matter of years?
The point is that Build Back Better is not stimulus. It's not meant to be deficit financed. The president has proposed that it be paid for and be fiscally responsible. It makes critical investments, and those investments will not cause inflation. In fact, they increase the capacity. So it is not inflationary. I'm not sure who you're referring to, but we know that this is ways to make the everyday costs affordable for families, the very families you were referring to, in prescription costs, in childcare, and to ensure that people can get back to work, and so that our economy got faster growth and is more equitably shared. Yes, it takes time to build and to make those kinds of investments, but that's the kind of sustainable growth that we seek going forward.
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you for the time. I can just tell you that those folks that I'm going to go visit back in that trailer park over the next week or so are probably going to say, I don't have years to recover. I have months, maybe weeks to recover, and we have to focus on the short-term crisis that we find ourselves in today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Till. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Toomey. So I'm sitting here and listening to this discussion, and to listen to my Republican colleagues, you'd think this economy in the United States is going to hell in a handbasket, as my mother would say. And yet I'm looking at the information here that we've got. In the first year of President Biden's term, economy has created over 6 million jobs. The unemployment rate has fallen to 4%, 3.1% in my state of Minnesota. Wages increased by 4.5% as well. I note that according to numbers released in January by the U.S. Census Bureau, an astounding 5.4 million new business applications were filed in 2021. So this says to me that the American people are hopeful and are feeling that they can achieve something in today's economy. Now, I'm not saying that inflation, nor do I hear any of you saying that inflation is not an issue that we need to pay attention to. But let me dive into this a little bit. A good friend of mine once said that for every complicated question, there is a simple answer that is almost always wrong. And that seems to me to be the case when it comes to some of the conclusions that my Republican friends are attempting to draw when it comes to inflation. So, Dr. Boushey, let me start with you. The question is, why is inflation going up? One simple answer pushed by my Republican colleagues is that President Biden and the Democrats have invested too much in the American people, and that's why inflation is going up. Is that the right conclusion to reach, Dr. Boushey?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. We are recovering from a historic pandemic. As Chair Rouse said, everything about our economy right now starts with that fact that we have to get the pandemic under control. That is why we had the economic challenges. It's why we needed to take those historic actions to support families through this crisis. And it's why at this point, even though we have supported families and with 6.7 million people have a job today that did not a year ago, an incredible achievement, one that forecasters did not think that we would be able to do. But that has meant that demand and supply are not in alignment. And because of the pandemic, it's been hard for suppliers to get goods to shelves. And people aren't going out and doing things, buying services at the same level that they used to. They're not going out to eat. They're not doing those things. They're buying stuff. But the pandemic has made it difficult for those things to get to market. And there's examples all across the economy, but it's an imbalance in supply and demand. And it is because families have been supported through this pandemic. That is a core part of the problem. They have jobs, and so they can go out and buy these goods and demand them. So yes, it is a complicated issue, but it doesn't mean that the economy is all bad.
Well, and it's not the correct assumption to draw or conclusion to draw that the actions that we've taken are the reason why inflation is going up. Dr. Rouse, this chart here shows that the inflation-adjusted income is rising for Americans in the bottom 50% of the economy. So what conclusion can we draw, based on what Dr. Boushey just said, about whether the strong action that we've taken has created more opportunity in the American economy as we've been struggling with this pandemic?
Well, when Congress took action because of the pandemic, there were two choices, right? Many people have been concerned about the spending, that we couldn't afford it, but there are two choices. We know that because we had to power down the economy, if action hadn't been taken, that actually would have shrunk economic activity.
Right.
And so therefore, we would have found ourselves with people with less income, we would have had less economic growth, our economy would be smaller. Instead, Congress, with you all and the prior administration, this administration, the Federal Reserve, thought it was more important to support the economy so that we could come out actually even stronger. In fact, the IMF has recently updated their forecast, projecting that the U.S. economy will be stronger in 2024 than it was before because of our actions. So what was important is to maintain the economic activity so that we could get through this downturn stronger than when we came in. Mm-hmm. So that was the rationale.
Thank you. And Dr. Bernstein, aren't Americans better off than they were a year ago? Don't we have millions more Americans vaccinated? Don't we have most of our students back in school? Aren't millions more Americans back at work?
Absolutely. And I think I want to underscore a point that you're making using the graph that you held up. If you actually look back at the heart of the pandemic in 2020, where you see that big dip in the red line and a big increase in the other color line, which I'm colorblind, so I don't know what color it is. I'll call it blue. That gap there is a good example of exactly what you're raising. Absent the fiscal support, incomes would have looked much more like the red line as opposed to the blue line. So
Exactly.
this is really trying to underscore the quote, what it would look like without the support that Chair Rouse was talking about. So yes, I think the thing that we never want to lose sight of is that, yes, families face an inflation challenge that the president underscores every time he talks about it. And we are not sitting there watching that. We're doing everything we can, near term, medium term, long term, with your help to try to ameliorate those pressures.
Well, and there's more that we want to do that we'd like help from our Republican colleagues to do, like lowering prescription drug prices, like lowering the cost of childcare, like transitioning to clean energy so that our utility rates are lower. And so I think those are the things that we can do that we are already doing, thanks to the leadership of the president. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator Smith. Senator Ossoff from Georgia is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your service. Ms. Rouse, I'd like to discuss the affordable housing crisis faced by Georgians with you for a moment. Statewide home prices were up 19% year over year in December. I hear from constituents every day in places like Macon, Columbus, and Atlanta about how the dream of homeownership, the ability to afford rental properties is becoming increasingly unattainable. Of course, this is not a new phenomenon. The affordable housing crisis has been growing and brewing for over a decade. First question for you, please, Ms. Rouse, is will you commit to joining for a call or meeting with me, with Macon-Bibb Mayor Lester Miller, and Columbus Mayor Skip Henderson, and Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens to discuss how the White House can help support our efforts in Georgia to increase the supply of affordable housing?
Okay, you're putting me on the spot, Senator. What I will say is, and I'm open to, to considering the invitation, but we completely understand that the housing crisis is a long-standing crisis. It wasn't created by this pandemic, but it was exacerbated by the pandemic, and that there's been a long-run mismatch between the supply of housing and the demand. And that's why this is, the administration has put a focus on this through Build Back Better, as well as, things that the administration can do through administrative action. There was a discussion of tax credits and other supports, zoning and land use. So we understand the very importance of housing. We need to solve this problem. It's not unrelated to the discussion of inflation, and we need more affordable housing.
Ms. Rouse, thank you for that. But what I'm asking is not for a policy commitment. I'm asking for a commitment for a phone call or a meeting with me, with Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens, Macon-Bibb Mayor Lester Miller, Columbus Mayor Skip Henderson, to discuss how the White House can support our efforts in Georgia to increase the supply of affordable housing.
I'd be happy to join such a phone call.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Dr. Boushey, with business incubators located in cities like Augusta, Alpharetta, and Duluth, Georgia is a place where entrepreneurship is thriving. We have diverse immigrant communities who are contributing to the growth of entrepreneurship and small businesses. Interesting fact about Georgia, we have the 7th highest percentage of minority-owned startups in the country, and the bipartisan infrastructure legislation permanently authorized the Minority Business Development Agency, which will help minority entrepreneurs with technical assistance and access to capital. How does, in your view, limited access to capital affect the growth of minority-owned businesses and innovation more broadly? What policies might you suggest Congress can implement or the administration can undertake to address this issue?
Well, that's a great question. Small businesses are the lifeblood of the economy all across these United States, so it's an important part of our economy that we need to support. One of the things I want to note is that attention to who has access to capital is something that the administration has been focused on since day one. When the president came into office, he, as a part of his efforts to focus on equity, a whole of government approach to equity, one of the things that we focused on was making sure that the payroll protection program, the support that went out to small businesses, actually reached the intended businesses. There's actually new academic research out that just came out a couple of weeks ago showing that those new efforts that were really targeted at reaching the most vulnerable small businesses, businesses led by owners of color and women, that we were successful in doing that more so than previous iterations of the PPP program. So that gives me some hope that with a focused attention on questions of equity and putting that together with making sure that small businesses have access to what they need, that we can do that.
Thank you, Dr. Boushey. Dr. Bernstein, I have had the pleasure of visiting and working with the technical colleges and technical training institutions across the state of Georgia over the last year since I took office. For example, was with the leadership over at Gwinnett Technical College to understand more about the exciting workforce training programs they offer students, new innovations in robotic welding. They're offering training opportunities. And my view and the view of many in my state is that we need to make it easier for Americans to access technical training, technical colleges, vocational training, to develop the skills that are necessary for steady, good-paying work in rapidly evolving industries with increasing applications of technology. How, in your view, Dr. Bernstein, do workforce and technical training help improve productivity, opportunity, and our overall economy?
They do so by making probably one of the most important connections we can make in the labor market, which is the skills of the workforce aligning with the demands of employers, particularly in sectors and areas where that demand is growing, and those, of course, disproportionately tend to be in technical areas. So training workers for those jobs is so important, and the way you've framed it is exactly right. Decades ago, I've been involved in this for a long time, training was much too disconnected to job openings. It was more sort of getting yourself together, getting your act together in a way to be able to go out for work. We're much more focused now on employment-based training, connecting workers with employers' demands. Two other quick points. One, unions can be an essential force in making this connection, particularly through apprenticeship programs. And it's my understanding, I'm trying to think back of all the different proposals we've made in this space, I don't think the Biden administration has made a workforce proposal that does not include apprenticeships. So a combination of unions, apprenticeships, and the kind of technical training that you suggested is absolutely integral to good jobs at good wages.
Thank Senator Ossoff. Thank you, and happy birthday a day late, Senator Ossoff. Senator Cortez Mastow from Nevada is recognized from her office.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panelists here today. Let me just state the obvious, because I think some of my Republican colleagues obviously are out there stating the obvious, which is families and individuals are dealing with higher prices. What I didn't hear from some of my colleagues was, how do we address it? How do we find solutions working together to address it in the short term, long term? And I know one way to address it is to show up. I don't understand why my colleagues didn't show up to hearing the other day to reappoint Jerome Powell to the Federal Reserve, Bill Brainerd to the Federal Reserve, and look at 3 new positions. I have not heard that they have concerns about those individuals, so it disappointed to me that they didn't show up. Why is this important? Because the Federal Reserve has the important monetary tools to help us address inflation, which we see corresponding to the high prices that our families are dealing with right now. I see it in my state. I talk to my families. I talk to individuals. I see it at the gas pump when I fill up my tank. I see it in my own family when my mother goes grocery shopping and she's telling me the prices. And I see it when I'm shopping, when my husband's shopping. So the obvious is there, but what are we going to do about it? And so this is the conversation I appreciate for the panelists being here today, because unfortunately, some of my colleagues are more about stating the obvious, not finding solutions. But here's an area that I want to focus on because of the high prices that I see in my state, including housing. And this is an area that I've been talking to many within my state about. How do we increase that supply chain to address the high housing prices. And Dr. Bernstein, you talked a little earlier about this with Senator Warner, who highlighted the fact that we do have whether it's 5 million or 7 million, we have a housing shortage here. And what can we do about it, working together with the administration? I appreciate your comments that we need to continue, and you're coordinating, and the administration's coordinating with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and federal home loan banks, that we're looking at continuing low-income housing tax credit, and it's important to continue that in the BBB. Let me ask you this. In the Build Back Better bill, there were some housing components that were actually going to address the housing supply chain, and there's a number of them. Not just increasing the low-income tax housing credit authority, but there's reduction of bond financing threshold from 50% to 25%. To address it, there's 50% basis boost for properties serving extremely low-income households that we are looking at. We are looking at closing the qualified contract loophole to prevent the premature loss of units to early termination from the program. We're looking at protecting nonprofit sponsors' ability to purchase properties at year 15. We're looking to coordinate housing credit, renewable energy tax credits. We're even looking at our tribal communities that we know need affordable housing, and looking at area 30% basis boost. These were all proposals that we were looking at in the Build Back Better. And I can tell you, I am talking to members in my community about these proposals. This makes sense to increase the housing supply. My disappointment is my Republican colleagues aren't even there working with us. I'm hopeful that they hear this and are willing to help us address this issue instead of just pointing fingers. But can I ask you, based on the proposals that you've heard and some others, does that make sense? Are we working in the right areas, part of what we were looking at in the Build Back Better, to address that housing supply and address this issue in short term and long term?
Not only does it make sense, but I don't see how we achieve the housing goals that you articulated and that historically partisans on all sides of the aisle have shared. As you've suggested, much of the policies that you're talking about typically involve increasing access to housing finance, more often than not targeted at the bottom half of the housing market, which is where the supply constraints have been most acute. And historically, these have been bipartisan supported measures. These, in many cases, are subsidies that go to builders whose housing deals simply don't pencil out in the absence of the kinds of measures you're talking about. Now, we've tried, as you know, in our administration to leverage funds for the Capital Magnet Fund, to work with the FHFA to increase LIHTC equity investment caps significantly in order to, again, increase affordable financing for that sector of the market. And as you mentioned, in Build Back Better, there are extensive tax credits for the supply side, grants to rebuild and renovate, and community block grants to renovate infrastructure related to housing, as well as to push back on exclusionary zoning. Finally, what's particularly important about the comments that you've made is that every intervention that you've just elevated is on the supply side of the housing market. There is a demand side, and we can think about that and worry about that too. But the emergency is really on the supply side, and the financing policies that we've discussed answer the mail precisely there.
Thank you. And I know I've run out of time, and I will submit the rest of my questions for the record, because I do have concerns about what the administration is doing to restore international travel and our trade flows and prevent future instability in the hospitality sector. But let me say this. This is a time for people showing up, working together to find solutions, not to state the obvious to families, individuals that they already know. It's time to show up. It's time to have solutions, come to the table and work together. Clearly, there are solutions that are out there, but we need our colleagues, all of them, to show up at the end of the day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, before I jump into my questions, I'd like to urge my Republican colleagues who are taking the time to attend the hearing today to also do their jobs and vote on the 5 outstanding Fed nominees. If you're going to talk to the witnesses today about inflation, for example, then you should be just as motivated to actually fight inflation by making sure that the Fed has all hands on deck. And that means voting these nominees through right now. So let me turn to my questions. During President Biden's first year in office, the economy added a record 6.6 million jobs, more jobs than those added in the first years of the past 4 Republican presidents combined. Workers are benefiting too, with wages growing at their strongest pace in years. And this is particularly impressive because 1 year ago, many economists were predicting that at this point we'd still be caught up with high unemployment and slow economic growth as the world struggled to deal with the fallout from the pandemic. But this good news has also brought some bad news, inflation. Now, you might think inflation would also be bad for companies. After all, an increase in the cost of doing business would likely eat into a company's bottom line. But that's not happening. In fact, the CEOs of some of the biggest companies have been bragging to their investors that inflation has created a terrific opportunity for them to boost profits. Take the grocery chain, Kroger. Kroger has seen its business boom during the pandemic, with its stock price rising nearly 40% over the past year. Kroger's CEO recently told investors that, quote, "A little bit of inflation is always good in our business," end quote. So, Dr. Boushey, would you agree that it's easier for companies like Kroger to raise prices in an inflationary environment because consumers are generally aware that prices are going up, and that lets companies hide behind inflation to expand their profits?
Well, as you know, Senator, President Biden is very attuned to kitchen table budget issues, and he has been very focused on asking the regulatory agencies to be on the alert for price gouging. And I have in front of me a long list of things that have been happening over the past year on his work to make sure that markets are competitive and fair. But let me just note one, which is that the Department of Justice and the USDA have worked together to set up a website where farmers and ranchers can say where they see problems in their industry. And that's just one of many things. So it's an important issue.
So an important issue, but the point I'm trying to make here is the companies get to kind of draft in behind the inflation. And I take it you agree that that's what's going on here. Okay, so you're nodding your head yes. I'll take that as a yes. Let me go to another example. In a call with investors last week, the CEO of Tyson Foods, one of the big 4 conglomerates that controls as much as 85% of the meat market, said they've, quote, restructured our pricing approach, end quote, and are, quote, asking them, the consumers, to pay for inflation, end quote. Dr. Bernstein, if all Tyson was doing was raising prices to offset their production costs due to inflation, would you expect their profit margins to stay roughly the same?
Roughly the same, because
Roughly the same.
their price increases would offset their cost increases,
Right.
which would hold their profits.
Okay, so their profit should stay roughly the same.
Roughly the same.
If that's all that was going on. Of course, that is not what happened. Tyson nearly doubled its profit margin over the year to 11.3%, only the 4th time in the last 30 years that the company has achieved double-digit profit margins. And Tyson isn't making record profits because it is selling more. In fact, it's making record profits because it is charging more. The number of beef products it sold declined 6% over the year, while the price of beef went up 32%. So let's do one more example here. Another phrase we hear thrown around is pricing power. In a recent interview, the CEO of Chipotle said, "We're pretty fortunate with the pricing power that we have," end quote. And that, quote, "if we need to take more pricing, we have room to do it. To date, we've seen no resistance from our customers," end quote. Now, this sounds a lot to me like what Fed Chair Powell said when he was here last month. Big companies are, quote, raising prices because they can. So, Chair Rouse, let me ask you, for those of us who don't speak economist, is it right to say that when executives talk about pricing power, They're referring to a company's ability to raise prices and extract profits out of consumers without worrying about losing business.
I'd say it's fair to say that a company has pricing power when raising prices won't cause them to lose too many customers.
And can I just ask, I know I'm out of time, what is it that gives companies pricing power? Does concentration in an industry give companies more pricing power?
So market concentration does tend to create more pricing power, which is one reason why increasing competition is such an important component of the administration's economic agenda, because we know that increased competition also helps workers, spurs innovation, and generally helps markets function better.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say, I'm glad the Biden administration is not standing by. We can go after this concentrated power industry by industry, and that's what will help bring prices down.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Warnock from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Rising costs for families, as my colleague has indicated, is a persistent problem, and it's one that I'm hearing from Georgians about every day. And it seems to me that part of fighting against rising costs is ensuring that the Federal Reserve, the independent agency charged with managing inflation, has the leadership necessary in place. It seems a contradiction to me to talk about rising costs and to leave the Federal Reserve hamstrung. And so I would encourage my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join us in holding a vote on the 5 qualified diverse nominees in front of us. I've introduced a bill with my colleagues to suspend the federal gas tax. And in our bill, Treasury would ensure that these savings at the pump are passed on to Georgians, cutting their gas costs. Still, every day, we see headlines that large corporations and their wealthy investors have sought to take advantage of market volatility to pad their bottom line and enrich themselves while hardworking Americans are the ones making difficult decisions with their pocketbooks. They're seeing record profits, consumers in Georgia paying record prices. Dr. Bernstein, can you talk about some of the consequences of market concentration and corporate consolidation in this economy and over the past decades? And has this made corporations more powerful?
Unquestionably so, in terms of industries that are highly concentrated. We've mentioned meat packing, and you just heard Chair Rouse talk about some of the pricing implications of concentration, particularly an increase in price levels relative to an industry situation with considerably less concentration. So we share your intuition there.
Dr. Rouse, would you share that opinion?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's why the president signed an all-of-government effort. He signed an EO last summer to try to increase in competition. We've seen increasing concentration, and I believe it's 3/4 of industries. We know that with increased concentration, not only are firms able to raise prices relative to a more competitive market, but it generates less innovation. It can be worse for workers and generally not good for our economic health.
It's one of the reasons why I have been urging a federal investigation into apparent price gouging by international cargo carriers. We look at the supply chain issues. Of course, that's an important nexus point, and that price gets passed on to the rest of us. Can you say something about that, Dr. Boushey? Okay. Let me move on to another question. The expanded child tax credit, the largest tax cut in American history for working and middle-class families. Let me say that again, because I think that gets lost in the conversation. And when you say expanded child tax credit, the average person may not know what you're talking about. We're talking about the largest tax cut for working and middle-class families in American history. And it seems to me that making this tax cut permanent would go a long way. It would certainly cut childhood poverty in half all across our country. Now, I've heard arguments that this tax cut would contribute to the rising costs we're all experiencing. But when I talk to Georgians, I hear that this money goes toward everyday expenses. Georgians have told me that the tax
credit help them to pay for health expenses, pay off debt, buy a coat for their kid. Dr. Rouse, do you think that the concerns that the expanded child tax credit would add to rising costs are justified?
So the child tax credit, we know, has immense benefits for children, both in the immediate term in terms of reducing food insecurity, child hunger, child poverty. It improves their educational outcomes. It generates outcomes. These similar kinds of programs generate positive benefits as adults. They're more likely to work, increasing labor supply as adults. They have less criminal activity. So it has tremendous benefits for the children, improves the mental health of their parents. So there are tremendous benefits there. We do not believe that the child tax credit would be increasing inflation in particular, because the increase is just so small that the expanded price is modest relative to the size of the economy. And furthermore, under the president's plan, any increase in expansion of the child tax credit would be paid for. So we do not share that concern, and we believe that the benefits of the child tax credit is part of an overall effort to invest in children. Again, it is an important investment for increasing the economic capacity.
So it's a net benefit to the economy and the economies of these families.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warnock. Senator Reed from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for their testimony insights today. Dr. Rouse, labor participation rates are falling while demand for labor is increasing. Do you have any insights into why labor participation rates are falling and what we might do to raise them up?
Well, hello, Senator Reed. So labor force participation fell at the beginning of the pandemic, but actually we've had one of the fastest recoveries in labor force participation in record. So if we look at prime age labor force participation, those are Americans 25 to 54, is recovered 2.1 percentage points of the 3.1 percentage points that were lost at the onset of the pandemic. We know that participation is a little slower to recover than unemployment after recession, but our participation growth has actually been relatively strong. What you're probably referring to is we also see record numbers of job openings, so we have a very tight labor market. So there's no question that some people are not participating due to concern out of the pandemic. But let's also keep in mind that the pandemic, at the onset of the pandemic, we were almost at the height of the baby boom retiring. So even just looking at what would have been the change in labor force participation in our labor force without the pandemic, we would have seen a decline. In addition, with the pandemic, we've seen excess retirements. So many people, I think, will be coming back as the pandemic gets under control. But let's face it, we do have a labor force challenge in this country. Declining fertility, immigration has been stymied due to the prior administration, and then with the pandemic, we need to find ways to be improving our labor force participation and our labor supply, because that is part of economic growth.
Related to that is the nominal wages are rising because of the tight labor market. As we see more people coming back with the end of the pandemic, we hope, can we sustain this nominal wage growth?
You're right, Senator, that right now a lot of the wage growth is due to the fiscal support and what I call pandemic economics. So we see wages rising in nominal terms. But honestly, the president's economic agenda, so this includes the bipartisan infrastructure law, it includes USICA, it includes Build Back Better, which are designed to make important investments in our economy, should have the benefit of increasing labor productivity so that what we have are sustained wage gains that are due from increasing labor productivity, and therefore sustainable, and should be benefiting, those at the lower end of the wealth, income, and wage distribution, those in the middle, therefore more equitably shared.
In fact, the president's program is very specifically directed at trying to maintain wage growth for low-income, middle-income Americans very deliberately and very consciously.
It is. It's not only by ensuring that the kinds of jobs that they have are well compensated and high paying jobs, but also by making everyday costs more affordable, prescription costs, childcare costs, so that just overall family well-being and household balance sheets are growing and sustainable.
Thank you. Dr. Bernstein, you spoke very insightfully about the housing crisis we're facing today. And first, a question, with the anticipated rate increases by the Federal Reserve, do you think that will cool housing prices significantly?
Historically, increase in the federal funds rate show up fairly quickly in mortgage rates. And we're seeing some of that. And yes, that puts some dampening pressure on the growth in home prices.
But the rise in housing prices has been so significant that even with a dampening, housing is out of reach of many Americans way up into the middle class. This is not just an issue.
Yeah, so that's exactly the right way to think of it, in my view. We've referenced that a few times in the hearing today, the idea that the work of the Fed tends to operate through the demand side channel. What's really plaguing the housing market, particularly the bottom half, is the supply side. And we've tried to do what we can and have helped to support the creation, delivery, and preservation of about 100,000 affordable housing units over the next few years. But the task, the challenge of literally a decade of insufficient housing supply, particularly in the bottom half, is nothing that any administration can do by itself. It requires bipartisan support through the kinds of measures that we've been talking about today, and measures that this committee, again, historically on both sides, have supported, particularly when it comes to housing finance and ensuring that deals in the bottom half can occur.
I would add another factor here is that there's a critical role for state and local government, because land use,
Yes.
planning, and other factors might be as big a constraint on housing supply. But I think the administration's commitment, and also through the money we've given to states, governors' commitments to increased affordable housing is significant. It's now a front page issue. 10 years ago, it was sort of.
I don't think you're exactly right to raise zoning. I don't think we solve this problem without dealing with exclusionary zoning issues.
Thank you, Senator Reed, for your insight. Senator Toomey, in closing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just observed briefly, I think it's simply indisputable that with inflation running at a 40-year high, 7.5% annual inflation rate, wages are not keeping up. And that means Americans are falling behind. I think it's also very clear that super easy money and too much spending by Congress are two of the principal causes. It appears as though there's going to be some reining in of the former. It's just really important that we not engage in yet another spending spree, which will only make it worse. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Toomey. Thank you to Chair Rouse especially, and also, of course, to Dr. Bernstein and Dr. Boushey for sharing your insights today about the strength of our economy and making it work better for all Americans, and I know you emphasize that always. Our goal is simple. We want everyone to be able to get a job that pays good wages and can afford to raise a family and retire with dignity. We want the cost of living to be affordable so people's paychecks are not eaten away by expenses. We're making tremendous progress on jobs, as you and those charts certainly point out, giving workers more options, more power to negotiate higher pay and better working conditions. You all understand the importance and the advantage of carrying a union card. Our charge now is to keep that progress. If you work hard, you ought to be able to afford a middle-class life. It's that simple. It's something President Biden for sure understands. I look forward to continuing our efforts to make sure our economy reflects the dignity of work. For senators who wish to submit questions, for the record, these questions are due 1 week from today, February 24th. To the members of the CEA, please submit your responses to questions for the record within 45 days from the day you receive them. Thank you again for your testimony. Thanks. The committee is adjourned.